Hello, and welcome to this episode of Curiosity. Curiosity is a series where we will explore how to do data differently through conversations with a number of different experts from diverse backgrounds. I'm Simone Knight, and I'll be your host along this journey. I'm joined by Donald Farmer, who each week will have two new guests to explore how they do data differently. In this episode, we go to the design studio and speak to the makers who are crafting our future by creating more well designed and focused data applications that help both humans and machines make better decisions together. Information needs to be presented differently because it's being consumed differently. So, given all of the complexities of an enterprise, how do you build for both flexibility and scale? Our journey of curiosity begins now.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Curiosity, our series of interviews over the web where we discuss data and analytics and the role that this has in our enterprises, in our work, in our daily life. I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Willis and Ray Wang, two amazing people. And in fact, I think my biggest problem today is either going to be to control these guys or to limit this conversation to the time that we've got, because I'm really excited by it. Well, I would normally introduce Ray Wang, and like in 2019, I would have introduced him as the guy who does 300 keynotes a year. In 2020, how do I introduce you, Ray?
No problem. Just doing a lot of video. How's that?
There you go. The guy who does a lot of video. Well, tell us a little bit about your background.
I'm Ray Wang. I'm with Constellation Research. We're spending a lot of time here thinking about what the future looks like, what the business models are, what transformation's happening. And one of the biggest topics for us is this concept around data-driven digital networks and the need for decision velocity. So I will talk to that a little bit, but we're an analyst firm. I'm an analyst and been studying the market for the last 20 years.
That's great. Decision velocity. I can't wait to get onto that topic. And Chris, tell us about your role.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I guess most recently, our relationship and getting to know each other has been around data analytics and Domo. So I helped start Domo. It's like 8 years ago, which is amazing. It takes a while to transform the world. It takes a little longer than you expect. And before that, my background was heavy in design, typography, illustration, and journalism. So with Domo, I kind of have very often gone back to a lot of those disciplines to try to make data make more of an impact, to Ray's point, help improve decision velocity. And now with COVID, I think we're starting to see just an accelerated transformation and people looking to data and platforms to help and to sort of figure out what to do next and how to do it.
Well, yeah, well, you said it takes time to change the world, but if the world decides to change itself, it can do it pretty quickly. But tell me this. So our topic today is apps and actions. And one of the things that we discussed in an earlier episode was this idea of automated decision making and how this gets into artificial intelligence and so on. But human decision making is still absolutely critical to our business. And one of the areas that's been super interesting to me, and I think for you as a designer, Chris, and for you as an analyst, Ray, is this: how do we help people in this function of making better decisions, and how do we get the information into the hands of the user in a way in which they can make decisions? And given that we're in this world that has very dramatically changed over just in the last few months, and has transformed, has our decision making transformed? And maybe we should just start from this personally. How has your decision making been transformed in the world?
Oh, that's great. If it's okay, I'll jump in there. So I think that, the broader context here is that we've all been sort of thrust into a very sort of convulsive moment. Right, we're all reacting to something that we didn't really quite see coming. I mean, yes, intellectually we probably understood it, but emotionally our understanding of it is very, very different. And so I kind of look at this as a experiment or a million experiments that have all of a sudden been launched. And I think to your point, Don, what do we need to do? How do we need to think about it? I think we need to start asking different questions, and we need to start observing in ways we haven't observed before, because the status quo has been thrown right out the window. And I was talking to some college kids the other day, and I said, think of yourself as, maybe 30 years in the future, when your kids or your students are going to ask you, what did you do during the pandemic of 2020 to 20X, right? Who knows? It could be 2021, 2, 3, 4, et cetera. And what do you wish you could tell them? What do you wish you could have seen? And I think the way we need to see differently, because many of us, I think, are just reacting. And when we start to react under, tremendous anxiety, we start to get very myopic, right? And things that might be obvious to us in a few years are invisible to us now because we're kind of swimming in this. And I think the way we have to sort of combat this is by asking lots of different kinds of questions.
You picked up on something there that seems to be to contrast with something that Ray said, because in a sense, you're hinting at a kind of longer term scope of decision making. Looking back in the future, what would you have done? How would you prepare for that?
Yep.
And then Ray was talking about decision velocity. Assumably, how we speed up our decisions, how we make them more quickly. Ray, is there a conflict here between a longer term scope of decision making and the need to make decisions more quickly?
Donald, definitely not. Chris is definitely onto a great point, right? What we're really doing over time is we're starting the process of automating decisions and automating those processes. And once we automate those processes, what we have is really a longitudinal view of what's going on, right? And we can start thinking about what are the patterns, what are the trends, and why are they there. Once we get that automation in place, it's up to us to start using analytics and AI to think about what the patterns are, right? What ontologies emerge, what patterns occur, are those dependent processes, are those ad hoc processes, why do they happen? And then at that point, we can actually get to that decision velocity with a historical context, with an understanding of what's occurred, right? And the 4 biggest decisions we'll be asking in this world of autonomous enterprises and making those decisions is, when do I fully trust intelligent automation? When do I trust and when do I augment the machine with a human? Because we don't have all the nuances. We don't know exactly why decisions are made, why exceptions are made, why considerations are granted. And then, of course, when do we augment the human with the machine so we can make faster decisions? And then when do we reserve these decisions for human judgment?
That is really interesting. So if we reserve, there are going to be a class of decisions which are reserved for human judgment. I think that's becoming very clear.
Or Skynet's going to take over.
Well, there's that as well. Maybe we're not.
So.
But let's hope for the future that there is a realm of decisions reserved for human judgment. There's a realm of decisions for automation, and we, to a certain extent, because it's a model, we know how to model those inputs. But what are the inputs that we model to a human decision? How do we help humans make better decisions? It seems to me that sometimes we overlook this. I'm thinking in Chris's role as a designer and your role as somebody who's advising people on how to make better decisions. What do human beings need to make better decisions?
So the way I think about this is, one, looking at almost a first principles approach. So, what is it that machines ultimately do very well, and what is it that humans do very well? And, machines are remarkable at recall and speed, right? Those are things that, for the most part, humans are not that great. We're not most of us can't memorize an entire phone book, right? We just don't do that. However, we are able to see patterns with very small amounts of data, or data that, or maybe observations that are not easily turned into data that machines can use. And I think one of the things that, to Ray's point, that's going to become really important is the automated decision making was based on a historical context, right? We have lots of history to create these patterns, and then as designers and developers, we can try to figure out, well, where is it that a human needs to sort of get into the loop from a situational perspective, and then from a decision making perspective, and then where does the machine need to sort of take over? But one of the things that's been throwing us a curveball is that history is not repeating itself at this moment, right? Like, we're seeing lots of anomalies that are spiking up everywhere. And that is, I think, a real opportunity to show why augmented decision-making is so important, where people need to be able to, kind of evaluate, override, and maybe, raise the red flag on certain kinds of models, because what you're starting to see now, because we're all, for the first time in human history, I think, going through the same crisis at the same time, we're starting to see a lot more signal in the noise, right? A funny example might be, like Tiger King on Netflix, right? Tiger King on Netflix became one of the most watched documentaries of all time for 3 weeks. And then 3 weeks later, or the fourth week, it started dropping, and then it's dropped right off the top 10 lists. What's happened is, because we're all suffering through the same thing, we're all becoming early adopters across the entire planet, right? We're all remote working. We're all making remote decisions. We're all, to Ray's point, he's shifting the way he's doing his business and communicating and collaborating and connecting people. So I think that's how I would, as a designer, start thinking about the problem.
Well, I did certainly suffer through one episode of Tiger King. Never quite crossed the chasm there into that. But Ray, does this ring a bell to you? Or are we now a world of early adopters who are struggling to find the new technology that'll make a difference to us?
Well, this whole shared experience, like the world was living an entire shared reality experience at the same time, right? That basically threw out all the models, right? People had fixed models built on rules, right? Fixed rules that they had to manage and change and like adjust all the time. This is the case for AI driven actions, right? Because you want the machine learning to pick up the signals, pick up the patterns, right? Throughout the old rules, understand why, create new hypotheses, test those hypotheses, do an A, B, C, X kind of testing out there. And we finally can see like why those assumptions were wrong. I mean, a great example is a lot of our assumptions are built on density as a business model. And density as a business model does not work in a public health pandemic. And because you have that scenario, you're suddenly realizing, oh, wait, what happens if density is not part of the business model? What changes, right? What are those attributes? What are those signals that we're getting to? And back to Chris's point, right? The whole point here is getting better signal intelligence. This signal intelligence and dynamic feedback that comes in really gets us to think about what are the next best actions? What do we take? What's the context behind it? What's the attribution behind that? And more importantly, what is the motivation on the other end? And when we can actually start instrumenting for that, that's how we get to the ability to make better decisions, more precision decisions much more quickly.
Sorry, I'd love to add one thing to Ray's point, which is what I think the way I interpret that strategy is that we need to maybe start thinking less as marketers, C-level executives,
Yes.
HR people, and more like anthropologists, right? We have to understand, Ray, we were talking a little bit earlier, you were talking about tribes, right? Like people are tribal. They want to make connections. They want to collaborate. They want to be part of something bigger. And so we have to figure out how to get the technology and the people to work, and along with the data, to work in a way that is a bit more seamless. And the only way we can do that is by understanding, the roles that they play, their motivations, what their fears, their anxieties, and then figure out where those intersect, and then give them the best ways to manage that landscape. So I think that's probably a very big shift. And I think, maybe it's just from my design background. That's kind of the business I've been in for a long time. But now it seems more important for us to understand that.
But this is fascinating to me because you talked about the best inputs to this and help them to make the best decisions. Ray talked about enabling the next best actions. But isn't it the case that we're in a world right now where we don't know what best is? We've never been in this situation before. We don't have a pre-existing model to compare to. So how do we know what we're doing best? And I think you can see this if you look around the world and look at the decisions that people are taking, and they are human decisions about, the decisions that governments are taking about, economics, about the financial situation, but also about healthcare and about social, whether it's social distancing or any form of social control. Each government is trying to make a decision about what's best for its people in a specific scenario, but there's no one way in which you can say this is the best decision. Is the Swedish model best? Is the New Zealand model best? Is the whatever model is best? We can't really say that, can we? Which is a very challenging situation compared to the normal run of events where you've got something to compare it to.
Donald, you're completely right. But while we can't determine what is best, we now have the options to model out those decisions to understand the implications and being able to bring as much of that data together, at least make a judgment call. One of the challenges, especially in this post-pandemic environment, is we don't understand the etiology of COVID-19, and therefore we can't make a lot of these assumptions. But the assumptions we do know, we can actually control for those variables and start testing. And that's really what's important here, is the ability to start testing different models and understand the implications and using using that to bring back and improve your decision making.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ray on this one, which is you need to look at, not to be too consultant speaking or sounding about this, but you need to understand your problem space, right? So when you are in a known problem space, cause and effect are well understood. So you can look at the existing models and you can just apply them and tweak those to fit your specific situation. But as we know, the environment has changed so much that we're now moving into a either an unknown or a knowable problem space. And the way I think of that continuum is how well are cause and effect understood and coupled together. So, one of the great unknowns, if we talk about COVID, is that we don't know a lot about it, honestly. We know a lot more in a shorter amount of time than we would of any other virus, but we don't know, for example, no one's had this for more than a year, right? So no one on the planet has had this disease for more than a year. So we don't know lasting impacts. We don't know immunity. We don't know the safety of any sort of vaccine approaches. And there's many different kinds of vaccine approaches. So there's lots. So when I see that, I see red flags, right? I'm like, okay, we're moving into an unknown problem space. And to Ray's point, what do you do when you're moving into unknown problem space? You have to experiment, right? You need to tease out the cause and effect before everyone else does. So you need to probably think about your model of decision making in a different kind of context in that regard.
Experiment is a really interesting term, though, because it's something which businesses traditionally have pushed into one little area. That we have our labs; they do the experiments. The business itself, carries on, and maybe the results of an experiment in an innovation lab will come into our business. But we're all experimenting now. I mean, we're actually in this world of experimental strategy. I mean, Ray, how do you sort of talk to people about this? That the world is just one giant experiment just now, and that seems to some people very, very frightening, to others very kind of enlivening, but to all of us very confusing. Yeah.
It is definitely very confusing for folks that had prescribed beliefs as to what was going to be right versus wrong, or what was definitely a given business rule or a good business judgment. I think we have to re-examine what's going on and understand the models. And so I think the way to really do this is take for example, like companies that were doing manufacturing and they were doing lots of personalization, and they had this situation where you could get every variety, every color, every stock. In the middle of a pandemic, when you have to shut down 30, 40, even 60% of your capacity, you figure out what 80% of the items that are the most productive, right? And you're basically looking at, hey, is it maybe 60% of the items? Is it 40% of items? Is 20% of items driving 90% of the profits? You'll get to that analysis really quickly, and that'll change the way you look at what you do, how you do product line extensions, how you think about profitability and market share. And those are the types of decisions that were being made at the beginning of the pandemic. It's, well, the top 10 items that are driving 90% of my profits, and how do I change my line? It's those business questions. And I think we started out the conversation by talking about the business questions you ask. I mean, the answers are not important, right? The most important things is really like the questions that you ask,
Yep.
right? The questions that you ask kick off. It's the catalyst for figuring out what happens. And the smarter you ask in terms of the questions, the more curious your questions are, the better you're going to be.
I like that very much. The answers are not important. It's the questions you ask. That's because if you're asking the same questions,
Not as
if you have
important. Not as important.
not as important. That's true. Yes, yes, we can say that. But if you have a prescriptive model of how the world should be, you're going to keep asking the same questions in a world that has changed. Chris, as a designer, and I think this is where, in the sense the rubber hits the road, in order to help people navigate this, we have to present information to them in ways which, help to, in a sense, answer those new questions that they have who can't answer the old questions. And we've seen, I mean, it just from a design point of view, if you think of the apps that have been provided to us by governments, if you think of the visualizations that have been provided to us in the newspapers and websites, if you think of the way in which this information has been presented to people, we've been trying, I think, very hard as in the data world to help people make sense of a fairly complex data situation and continually changing data situation. But as a designer, have you been inspired or challenged or disappointed perhaps in what you're seeing? Do you have a strong opinion even?
Yeah, it's it's strange. All three of those at least, and maybe a few more. Uh,
All three
and
of those every day.
yeah, and the reason is so at Domo, for example, one of the things we've done is very early on. I think this was this was um, end of February. Actually, we started a COVID tracking project, just trying to aggregate all the data we get our hands on, and we started using it internally. And as I mentioned earlier, my early days were spent in journalism, and it was mostly infographics. I was designing infographics, and so I had a pretty strong journalistic ethics streak, right? Like I want to make sure the data is right. I want to make sure that the sourcing makes sense. I want to make sure that we represent the data in such a way that it's not misleading. Every visualization tells a story, but in a way, every visualization lies, right? I mean, you can't show every conceivable side of a visualization, but you need to have almost take on like a Hippocratic oath, from a design standpoint. You just try to do the least amount of harm that you can. But what I've seen is that one, again, we're all becoming kind of early adopters again. Everyone is now looking at infographics and data every single day, and I think in a way that they didn't do before, right? Because there are lives and jobs on the line. The conversations you have with people, I think, are probably very different. I mean, even though we may not all have the same opinion or necessarily the same idea about what we should do next, people seem to be actively informing themselves. The challenge is, and this is where I think, apps and the design of apps becomes important, is not everyone is equipped with the proper way to critically analyze information and data, right? There was a paper I was reading over the weekend where it said, most people really don't know what they know or don't know, right? And it's because they never have to go deep enough. They never go deep enough into understanding why they hold a particular opinion. And I think that is one of the real challenges. There is no scarcity of information and misinformation out there, but there is a scarcity of sense making, of credibility, and those are the things that are critical to making better decisions. So I think that's where there's a big challenge and a big opportunity for a lot of
There's
us.
still room for humans.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, actually, this question of how we present the information. Now, I was saying, Ray, that you do these hundreds of keynotes a year. And if you do that, one of the things that you learn to do very quickly, and you're a master at it, is having great slides and having great visualizations of the points that you're trying to get across. And I've seen some of your slides about, how we balance between human decisions and automated decisions, and you've got this kind of great slide that stacks up all the different kind of parameters that around which you might make that decision. Have you had to change the way in which you present information to people in design terms because you're online? You're a very interactive speaker. You're always getting feedback back from the audience, and I can't imagine that's possible or at least doable in the same way. So have you changed in your design terms the way in which you present information to the audience in this time?
You definitely do. It's really about narratives, right? Right now we're having speaking voice, but if we go keynote, we'd be talking like this, right? And you get like different dynamism. You come in, you pause, you make people think, right? All those techniques actually work because you're no longer getting that dynamic feedback loop, right? I can't tell if the audience is laughing. I can't tell if there's a smile. I can't tell if someone's out there. I can't pull someone randomly from the audience, as you've seen me done before, to actually be part of, the gig, right? And so what you have to do is you have to display information differently. You have to assume people are consuming it at different rates. And you have to make it dynamic enough for people to actually pay attention. And so you have to assume short attention spans, bite-sized information, visual, back to what Chris was saying. I mean, the infographics you were working on back then, I mean, visuals are so important, right, to get people's attention. Or go with no visuals and describe the scenario, right? Get people to close their eyes and think. That's also a very interesting technique I've seen people use, and I've tried. I say I've tried. I don't know how well it went. So maybe
That's
they just fell
fascinating.
asleep.
Because giving a keynote is a design problem as much as building an app is a design problem. You're trying to solve, in fact, very similar issues of how you get attention, how you draw attention to the right things, and how you get people to kind of to dig into that. Um, in the world of apps, and have you found any particular app or any particular way of visualizing or describing the situation in that you found particularly useful yourself?
One of my favorite apps is this company called Tribe. And what it's doing is allowing you to design for serendipity. And we think it's a very important piece. Like when you walk into a room in a conference hall, you'll notice that some people are gathering around. You kind of scan for someone you make eye contact, you go there, you start the conversation. This does it visually, almost like when we go back to look at Sun's Project Looking Glass, where you're able to have these orbs that kind of connect and suddenly you actually spawn meetings. Well, anytime you bring two people together, it spawns off a video call, right? And you can add people and people keep gathering. But when you get to about 7 to 10 people, you see people taper off, have different conversations. That's a very, very important tool to actually facilitate those kind of conversations that are happening naturally. And I think it's important because while someone's speaking, it's not the speaking that's generating the interest. It's the conversations with the people next to you, the networking and the learning on the side. I think that's going to become a very useful tool. And you're going to see people start doing that. And then the other piece is really having multiple screens of stuff. I love the Bloomberg screens, right? Like I watch Bloomberg all day because I can see stuff that's going on. I can mute, I can hop in. In fact, I'm looking, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not looking right now, but the point being is like the ticker on the bottom, the headlines on the side, the programming that's going on. That's kind of how we work. And the ability to interact in different formats is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you have to rush off and make a sale, we'll understand if you disappear from the screen for a bit. But I think one of the things for me that's a difference between apps and, say, applications in a broader sense is this question that apps are fundamentally local. They're about where you are when you're using them. And you can have location-aware applications, but an app, in the sense that you were talking about coming into a room and where are the people. Well, that's very local. It's about where you are, and being able to take that into the more abstract world of interacting online seems to me like an interesting design challenge. But Chris, again, in your role as a designer, do you see a big distinction or a significant distinction between the app that we're talking about and the application in the broader sense, the big business application and the focused app?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. When we look at apps designed for people and making better decisions, we try to take into account four sort of major areas, right? We try to understand what's the information or the data that they need to use for the app. What is the problem they're trying to solve? What is their role in understanding, both about the organization or the task at hand? And then what is the best outcome we're looking for them to arrive to? So that's, I think, a bit different than, when I think of sort of large enterprise applications, which are kind of designed to serve, big functions or be big parts of the business engine. In the case of applications, what you guys are talking about is I think absolutely critical, but also difficult, because you're trying to create apps that might only be used a few moments out of the day, right? So they have to be extremely focused. They have to be very task specific. They have to be very context aware, whether that is location, or in the case of what Ray's talking about, a social context, or maybe even a content context. So, if you're talking about, like, say something like designing for serendipity, that might sound kind of ludicrous, but it's absolutely possible. And I think it also intersects with the greater need and improvements in machine learning and AI, right? We can actually start doing more of that because we know more about you from a sensor standpoint, from a let's say a recommendation engine standpoint, right? We can recommend all different kinds of things, whether they're conversations or people or other kinds of content. So I think we have a lot more tools at hand than we did before. This would have been very difficult even just a few years ago. But it's not just the technology, right? It's the technology with the right kind of focus. And to Ray's point, asking different questions, right? What if? So yeah, I think absolutely. I see those as different things than.
Yeah,
than,
it's a
maybe I would
fascinating
have before.
contrast, isn't it, between
Yeah.
the app that you were talking about, which you've said is a very specific context and is used for a very brief period, perhaps. It's got one thing that it does, so you use it for a brief period during the day. And then what Ray was talking about, the Bloomberg screens, which are more about situational awareness, and you sit there watching four screens all day long. There are people who switch on Bloomberg in the morning and they're there until the evening. That's a very different mode of using, a very different mode of usage, a very different mode of awareness that you're using. Um, and perhaps, in your life, Ray, I mean, you're very wired into technology. You're presumably, switching between these modes all the time. Is that something that we're all learning to do now? I think of people learning to do online schooling, and all our communications, our Zoom communications that we're doing. Are we learning to kind of live more like Ray with this technology awareness and yet this very agile use of apps?
We definitely are. And there's a third mode people don't think about. The two modes that Chris and I were describing were explicit modes. There are implicit modes where actually data collection is happening in the background. And this is really what we call powering ambient experiences in these applications. It's capturing things in context. It's capturing maybe my eye movement. It's capturing maybe, my pace, my diction, my tone, right? What I'm saying, right? All these things are being captured and trying to understand, is there some attribution that can be made to then provide that intelligence to drive that next best action. I mean, context comes in time and location and where you're sitting in a business process and sentiment, but it also comes in voice and nonverbal cues that are popping up. And as sensors get better in terms of picking those types of cues up, we have better attribution, we have better information, and we get better signal intelligence in those feedback loops.
So I think I've heard of some of this, and where people talk about voice analysis. And typically we might think of that as just speech to text. We extract the text that somebody's saying, and then we can analyze that text. But I've heard of applications, for example, using call centers, which can also analyze whether somebody's stressed or angry or confused or upset, and therefore direct the calls to people who might be better experienced at dealing with those emotions. Is that the sort of thing you mean?
Exactly. It's really about being able to sense that information, creating those ambient experiences in the background, right? It's every, context, choice, and the ability to actually create that next best action. Bringing those three things together allow for a high degree of personalization and a lot of learning on the background, which then improve those apps over time.
That's really interesting. So Chris, context, choice, and next best action as three critical elements of the experience. That makes sense to you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I was, as Ray was talking, I was thinking back to a time. This was a long time ago. This was like the early 2000s. I was working with Ericsson, and I was developing a model called context bubbles for mobile devices. Now, at the time, we just had flip phones, right? And we had WAP gateways, and we really could only put a few, like 40 characters of text out there on the screen, but we had the idea. And again, now we are at this point where we could actually pull all of this information together, as Ray's talking about, and then use a lot of different kinds of algorithms and design ideas and technologies to respond to somebody and give them the right kind of information in the right kind of way. Maybe the most well, one of the things that popped up as Ray was talking about was like the HUD displays in fighter jets, right? So those are very context aware. They're
That's
keeping track
awesome.
of who's trying to kill you, and if you're too close to a mountain that's trying to kill you, and all the other things, like are there malfunctions in your aircraft that are trying to kill you, and are you getting the aircraft into a situation where it's out of control? And if so, what they'll do is they'll give you either visual information or cues, or they'll give you audible ones like pull up, or they'll reduce the visual noise on your display so that a pilot, when task saturated, can more easily make the right decision. They may not be able to do 70% of the thinking they did just a moment before. And I think we're going to be putting that kind of intelligence into most of our applications. I mean, you're seeing it already in cars, right? Ray was talking about we could maybe listen to your voice and understand your stress, but we could also see if your eyes are wandering off the road or if you're looking at your phone. Well, that's augmented decision making, right? The car is going to decide to either stop or swerve or tell you or admonish you for not paying attention. So I think we're going to see that pop up in lots of different ways.
Interesting. In
Oh, definitely.
business, is there a role for this in business?
Oh, I believe absolutely. I'm sure Ray has some ideas on this one, but the idea of Well, in business, you want to know what normal is, right? So just starting with smart ways and deeper ways of understanding anomalies and surfacing those and understanding the connection between things. I just got off a call with a client this morning, and one of the things I was kind of warning them against when they were looking at using analytics was only using singular metrics. Because again, back to my days in newspapers, you want to give the richest, densest information you can, but not overwhelm people. But you want to give them the opportunity, at least the chance of seeing connections that they didn't see before, right? They need to collect a lot of dots before they can start
That's
connecting
great.
dots.
So it's not
And
just the next best decision; it's the next best question as well. They have to be able
yeah,
to ask
yeah,
another question. Yeah.
yeah, correct. And so what they did was they ended up with a whole page of singular metrics. And while it seemed simple,
We-
it
I'm
wasn't
laughing.
clear what it was telling
We
them,
call this
nor what
we call
questions
this
to ask.
vanity metrics.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, how many impressions? Ooh,
How
great.
many
Right.
impressions?
Yeah.
That's
What's your
it.
revenue? Who cares? Right. I mean, it's
And
not until you combine them with an action or some financial number does it matter, right? So
yeah,
you're right.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We see a lot of
And,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and what you see is people will, in the vacuum of that extra kind of data and the ability to sort of question and correlate, they're going to start creating stories, right? They're going to say, well, I think I know why it went up there. And it might make no sense at all, because they can't, again, back to the critical thinking aspect, they can't correlate that with something else. And there's a natural inculpable ignorance there, which is they don't know what they don't know. So are you providing them the broader context to say, well, maybe you should ask a slightly different question, or maybe you should question the conclusion you came to so quickly?
It's interesting. I like the term vanity metrics, Ray, because it does speak to how people use these. And of course, if the metrics are oversimplified, people often end up managing to the metric. They end up trying to manage the KPI rather than actually trying to manage the broader context. You were saying that these almost don't matter at some point without the broader context. Yeah.
Yeah, totally right. I mean, you want to think about the next best action, right? So total impressions, who cares, right? Right. Total viewers, who cares? But how many people shared those views, right? So you tie it to an action, it no longer becomes a vanity metric. Or, we got 7,000 leads. Okay, well, what was the cost per lead, right? And when you start asking questions, back to Chris's first point was really important. Like, what questions do you ask? What business questions do you ask? Right? That is so important. And what you want to do is ask questions where there are no answers, or traditionally there were no answers because you didn't know where the data sources were. Right. And so, do I add 10 more people in marketing, or do I go out and buy $1 million ad? Which one's going to have better effect? Well, I don't know. I don't have all the data. Well, that's the point. Right. You don't have all the data right now, but let's go find the data sources, work our way back, and then we can figure out what that next best action is. And then we can start building apps that actually start answering the questions that really matter than these really narrow, silent, functional fiefdom questions that don't make sense.
This is fascinating. I'm going to bring this back to the situation we're in right now, because I think several of the things you've said are just super relevant, that we don't know what the data sources are that are relevant. We don't know the full context of the decisions we're making. We don't know what the next best kind of action is, never mind what the next best question is. We're struggling all the time to do this. How are we doing? Let me ask you the very broad question. How are we doing?
We suck at it. We got to be able to build quick, lightweight apps everywhere to answer these questions. We got to bring data from all these different sources and just say, hey, what are you trying to answer? We got to experiment and figure out what's there, right? And the problem is the cost to do that has been so hard. People have been constrained. Oh, you need to be a developer. Oh, you need to have this kind of technical knowledge, right? The more we can democratize the process of answering these questions, the faster we can make better decisions, and the more we can tune for things that don't have playbooks. Like, we're building playbooks today for pandemics that might not come again for another 100 years. But hey, what? Every 100-year event has happened this year, so I don't know what's going on.
That's absolutely true. Chris, from your point of view, let me ask you the same question. How are we doing in the current situation? From a design point of view, from a decision-making point of view, from a data analysis point of view?
There's lots of different levels. There's lots of different ways you can answer that. I think we're kind of a C- right now. And the reason is, I would love, as a designer, you're kind of a natural futurist, right? And you have to be optimistic about that, right? So I'm always optimistic, but you have to be practically optimistic, right? Or realistically optimistic. And the fact of the matter is, we've all been thrust into a situation that we're not terribly well prepared for. But we are accelerating a lot of trends that were on the horizon anyway. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. And to Ray's point, I think there's an opportunity to be really, really innovative, even in small areas. And we're going to need that. We're going to need people to start. Well, we're already seeing this because there's a vacuum. Let's just take the COVID case, for example, right? When you have a pandemic, what you really need is a smart, centralized response. We haven't had that, at least in this country, right? And so what we've seen is companies like Domo and others sort of have to fill in the gap, even private citizens, in aggregating data, vetting data. You're seeing, news organizations like the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, sort of providing a public good out there in the vacuum of any, sort of giant aggregated government data offering, right? So that is not great, right? It'd be great if there was more of a partnership. But it's not, it shouldn't be an either or situation. It shouldn't just be, let's say, the government does everything and we wait for that to, solve our problems, and private does everything.
Is this raised democratization of data, but in a sort of negative way? Is democratized because it has to be, in a sort of negative sense, somebody's filling the gap? Or is it democratization in a positive way, that it is actually great, we're opening up, and we're opening up sources, we're opening up decision making, we're opening up knowledge creation to a wider audience? I'm wondering, Ray, maybe we wrap up with this sort of thought. What have we learned from this situation this year that we are going to take forward into business about the way in which we make decisions?
We were woefully unprepared, right? There was some level of intelligence, but not a continuous level of signal intelligence. And so there's a need to actually capture that data on an ongoing basis so we can make both the short-term and the long-term decisions and understand trends. There's another piece that's important between understanding where you need passive versus active use of intelligence and how to bring those pieces together. Sometimes I just need to grab information on the fly. Sometimes I need to take action on that information. And I think organizations should be thinking about this concept around decision velocity, trying to get the highest accuracy. This is a weird way to do it. Highest accuracy on precision decisions. That's a very interesting way to do this, right? Highest accuracy on precision decisions possible, and really to increase that the speed of those decisions, so that when you face this kind of scenario, you can actually create lots of planning scenarios, forecasting, and think about, how to actually model what is happening so you can come to some level of decision making. And then where can we automate a lot of these decisions so that the ones that we actually are very confident about, we can actually free up time to be a lot more strategic. And I think that's one of the easier ways to get to this.
That's fascinating. Chris, from your point of view, what have we learned in design terms that we will take forward into our business in the future
So I
from
think
this strange
yeah,
year?
for me, the one of the fascinating aspects of this is that this pandemic has been a pandemic that's been told with data, right? So now overnight, everybody, is out there interpreting data, and now they may not interpret it all the same way, but I think we have all sort of become, we've all essentially gone to a data analytics boot camp in some way, right? We're inundated with stats and charts and trends all the time, and it turns out, again, we're not necessarily all great at interpreting all of that. So I think going forward, to Ray's point, it's going to be about creating a lot more very well sort of designed and focused data applications to help people make better decisions. Everything from, can I go into the office today? Should my kids go to school? Is it okay to do a play date at some point? It's going to go on and on and on here. And unfortunately, because we're still in that sort of unknown problem space, as we talked about before, I think there's not going to be just one app that solves any of this, right? It's going to be like this whole epidemic causing, launching a million experiments. There's going to be millions of other kinds of sort of apps, whether there's, like we're doing at Domo with the safe worker. I think companies are going to have to try to figure out how to create better digital platforms for creating these apps on top of them, right? Because it's not going to be just because you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and the information is changing, and the uncertainty is a bit higher than you're used to. Companies do not like uncertainty, right? You need flexibility. So you need flexibility and scale. And I think that's where the focus is going to be. Yep.
Yeah, I think that handling of uncertainty, certainly there is tremendous uncertainty, and but flexibility and scale to that. I'm been so positive about this conversation. It's interesting. We're talking about a subject in some ways which is very difficult and very challenging, but you've both given me in very different ways, perhaps more optimism than I had an hour ago. Optimism that, in fact, even though this is new and tremendously challenging, we fundamentally do have the capabilities of handling this and seeing it through. Ray, I want to thank you so much for being part of this conversation. You brought an amazing perspective. I can't actually wait until I see what 2021's keynotes from Wang look like. They're going to be very different from 2019's keynotes, but I know they're just going to be equally engaging and exciting. And Chris, I can't wait to see what this, how this evolves in design terms, and see what the future looks like. Thank you both very, very much for being part of our conversation.
In this episode, we learned that there is contrast between business apps and recreational apps that people use daily. They have to be focused, task-specific, and context-aware. We need to uncover patterns because business users need information served up in short, small bite-sized pieces to help them see connections where they couldn't have seen them before. To get this right, companies have to work on creating better digital platforms for developing superior apps. Experimenting now prepares you for crises later. I encourage you to obsess over the questions. The answers aren't as important as the questions you ask. They are the catalyst for what happens next. Trust me, the more curious you are now, the better off you're going to be later. I'm Simone Knight. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Curiosity, and remember, stay curious.